He bought her for $12 at a slave auction in New Orleans in 1848, when she was 15 years old and he was 32. Her name was Sarah, though he immediately changed it to whatever he pleased on any given day, sometimes calling her by her name, sometimes by crude terms that reduced her to an object, sometimes by no name at all, simply gesturing when he wanted her attention. For 23 years, from 1848 until 1871, Jacob Rousseau kept Sarah as his property, his slave, his concubine, and after the Emancipation Proclamation, supposedly freed her in 1863, as his wife in a marriage that was never legal, never consensual, and never anything but the continuation of ownership under a different name. When federal authorities finally investigated the Rousseau plantation in 1871, following reports from neighbors who had grown disturbed by screams they heard at night, they found Sarah chained in a basement room where she had been confined for the previous 8 years. She weighed 73 pounds, had scars covering most of her body from repeated beatings and burnings, had lost most of her teeth from malnutrition and physical trauma, and initially couldn't speak, not because she was unable to, but because, as she later explained through writing, she had been trained through violence not to make sounds that might disturb her owner. Jacob Rousseau, when confronted by federal marshals, produced a marriage certificate dated January 1863 and insisted that Sarah was his wife, that everything that had occurred between them was the private business of a husband and wife, that authorities had no right to interfere in his household. He claimed that Sarah's condition was the result of illness, that he had been caring for her as best he could, that the chains were necessary to prevent her from harming herself during episodes of mental instability. He presented himself as a devoted husband, struggling with a disturbed wife, a man who deserved sympathy rather than investigation. But the medical examination of Sarah told a different story. The physicians who examined her documented injuries spanning decades, old scars layered over older scars, bones that had been broken and healed improperly multiple times, evidence of sexual violence so extensive and prolonged that doctors struggled to find medical language adequate to describe what had been done to her. They documented malnutrition patterns consistent with deliberate starvation, evidence of prolonged confinement in positions that would have been agonizingly painful, marks from restraints that had been worn for such extended periods that they had created permanent grooves in her wrists and ankles. Before we continue with the horrifying story of Sarah and Jacob Rousseau and the 23 years of slavery that continued long after slavery was supposedly abolished, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. Because what happened to Sarah and how Jacob Rousseau was able to continue enslaving her for 8 years after emancipation by simply calling her his wife reveals the darkest truths about how slavery's legacy persisted long after the Civil War ended. New Orleans in 1848 was one of the largest and most economically important cities in the American South, a major port where cotton, sugar, and other agricultural products were shipped to markets throughout the United States and the world. The city was also one of the most significant slave markets in the country, where thousands of enslaved people were bought and sold each year, their lives and labor treated as commodities to be traded for profit. Slave auctions were public events, held in dedicated auction houses or in open squares, where enslaved people would be displayed, examined by potential buyers, and sold to whoever offered the highest bid. Sarah had been born into slavery on a cotton plantation in Mississippi in 1833. Her mother had died when Sarah was 10 years old, and Sarah's owner, facing financial difficulties, had sold several of his slaves, including Sarah, to settle debts. At age 15, Sarah was transported to New Orleans along with dozens of other enslaved people and put up for auction. She later described standing on an auction block while white men examined her teeth, her body, discussing her as if she were livestock, speculating about what kind of work she could perform and how many years of productive labor she might provide. Jacob Rousseau attended that auction, looking for an enslaved woman to work as a domestic servant and to serve his personal needs in ways that were understood but rarely spoken of explicitly in polite society. He was a small-scale planter who owned about 200 acres of land in St. Charles Parish, about 25 miles upriver from New Orleans. He grew sugarcane, using enslaved labor to plant, tend, and harvest the crop that was then processed into sugar and molasses at a nearby mill. Rousseau was not wealthy by the standards of major plantation owners, but he was prosperous enough to maintain his land and to purchase enslaved workers when he needed additional labor. Rousseau bid $12 for Sarah, a relatively low price that reflected her young age and the fact that she had no specialized skills that would make her particularly valuable. He took her back to his plantation that same day, explaining during the journey what her duties would be. She would cook, clean his house, wash his clothes, tend his garden, and serve him in whatever other ways he required. The last part was stated without euphemism. Rousseau made it clear that Sarah's body belonged to him as completely as her labor did, that he would use her sexually whenever he pleased, and that resistance would be met with violence severe enough to teach her never to resist again. Sarah later testified that the sexual abuse began the night she arrived at the plantation, that Rousseau raped her repeatedly during her first week in his household, establishing from the beginning that she had no autonomy, no right to refuse him anything, no protection from whatever he chose to do to her. She was 15 years old, alone on a plantation where the other enslaved workers were kept in separate quarters, and where Rousseau's house was isolated enough that screams would not be heard by anyone who might intervene. The pattern that would define the next 23 years was established in those early weeks. Rousseau used Sarah as a combination of servant and concubine, requiring her to maintain his household during the day and be available for his sexual use at night. He was violent when she failed to meet his expectations, beating her with belts, canes, or his fists when food was not prepared correctly, when cleaning was not done thoroughly enough, when she moved too slowly or failed to anticipate his needs. He was also violent when he used her sexually, deriving pleasure not just from the act itself, but from the pain and fear he could inflict, from the absolute power he exercised over another human being. Sarah learned to be invisible, to move through the house silently, to complete her tasks without drawing attention, to endure Rousseau's abuse without reaction, because any sound or expression of pain would trigger more violence. She learned to dissociate during the sexual abuse, to separate her mind from what was being done to her body, to find some mental space where she could preserve some fragment of self despite the systematic destruction of her humanity and autonomy. For 14 years, from 1848 to 1862, this was Sarah's existence. She lived in a small room off the kitchen, worked from before dawn until late at night, ate whatever scraps Rousseau allowed her to have, and endured regular beatings and rape as the routine conditions of her enslavement. She had no contact with the other enslaved people on the plantation, except when Rousseau required her to help with harvest work during peak seasons. She had no opportunity to escape. The plantation was isolated. She had no money, no knowledge of how to navigate to somewhere safe, and she knew that fugitive slaves were pursued, captured, and subjected to horrific punishments when returned to their owners. The only variation in this pattern came when Rousseau occasionally brought friends or business associates to his house, requiring Sarah to serve them, and sometimes offering her sexual services to guests as a gesture of hospitality. Sarah later testified that being raped by strangers was somehow worse than the regular abuse from Rousseau, because the strangers treated her with even less humanity, viewing her purely as an object for temporary use, rather than even as a slave who belonged to someone and who might need to be kept alive and functional. By 1862, Sarah was 29 years old and had lived more than half her life as Rousseau's slave and victim. She had no education, no skills beyond domestic work, no family or friends who knew where she was or what was happening to her. She had been so thoroughly broken by years of abuse and isolation that she had stopped imagining escape or freedom, had accepted that this was her life and that it would continue until she died or until Rousseau tired of her and sold her to someone else. Then came the Civil War and the Union occupation of New Orleans in April 1862. Federal forces under General Benjamin Butler captured the city and established military control over southern Louisiana, bringing Union authority and the promise of emancipation to enslaved people in the region. As Union forces moved into St. Charles Parish, enslaved people began fleeing plantations, seeking protection from Union troops and freedom from slavery. Rousseau's plantation lost most of its enslaved workforce within weeks of Union forces arriving in the area, as people who had been held in bondage for years suddenly had the opportunity to escape. But Sarah did not flee. When other enslaved people left the plantation, she remained in Rousseau's house, continuing to perform her duties, continuing to endure his abuse. Years later, when asked why she didn't escape when she had the chance, Sarah explained that she hadn't believed escape was possible, that she had been so conditioned to view Rousseau's control as absolute that she couldn't imagine successfully leaving, and that she had been terrified of what Rousseau would do to her if she tried to escape and failed. The psychological impact of 14 years of slavery and abuse had been so profound that even when the opportunity for freedom presented itself, Sarah couldn't recognize it or act on it. Rousseau, facing the loss of his enslaved labor force and the reality that the old system of slavery was collapsing, decided to adapt rather than resist. In January 1863, shortly after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring slaves in rebel states to be free, Rousseau told Sarah that things were going to change, that she was now free, but that she should stay with him, that he would marry her and take care of her, that as his wife she would be protected and provided for. He took Sarah to a local official who was sympathetic to former slaveholders and who was willing to issue marriage certificates to white men marrying formerly enslaved women, sometimes for money, sometimes simply as a gesture of racial solidarity. The marriage between Jacob Rousseau and Sarah was not legal under Louisiana law at the time, as the state had laws against interracial marriage that would not be repealed until Reconstruction. But in the chaos of wartime and occupation, with civil authorities disrupted and with Union forces focused on military matters rather than marriage regulations, these illegal marriages were often recorded without challenge. Rousseau obtained a certificate stating that he and Sarah were married, and he used this document to redefine their relationship in legal terms while maintaining the actual substance of ownership and abuse. Sarah later testified that she had not consented to this marriage, that Rousseau had informed her rather than asked her, that she had not understood what marriage meant beyond Rousseau telling her that now she was his wife instead of his slave, but that nothing about her daily life would change. And indeed, nothing did change except the terminology. Sarah continued to live in the same room, continued to perform the same domestic work, continued to be beaten and raped with the same regularity. The only difference was that Rousseau now justified his behavior by claiming the rights of a husband rather than the rights of a master, though in practice those rights appeared to be identical. The end of the Civil War in 1865 and the beginning of Reconstruction brought federal authority and military occupation more extensively into Louisiana. Union troops were stationed throughout the state to enforce emancipation, to protect formerly enslaved people, and to suppress resistance from former Confederates who refused to accept the new social order. In this environment, many formerly enslaved people were able to assert their freedom, to leave plantations, to seek work for wages, to reunite with family members, to begin building lives as free people. But Sarah remained with Rousseau, still enduring the same abuse, still living in the same conditions of controlled captivity that had defined her enslavement. Rousseau told her that as his wife, she was obligated to stay with him, that the law gave husbands authority over wives, that leaving him would be abandonment of her marital duties. He told her that as a black woman with no education and no resources, she would be unable to survive on her own, that white society would not accept or help her, that she would starve or be forced into worse situations than what she experienced with him. These threats were not entirely false. Reconstruction-era Louisiana was chaotic and dangerous for formerly enslaved people, particularly for black women who had no family support or economic resources. While legal slavery had ended, social and economic conditions often meant that freedom was more theoretical than real, that black people found themselves working in conditions that resembled slavery in everything but name, that violence and exploitation remained constant threats. For someone like Sarah, who had been isolated and abused for so many years, who had no experience of freedom or self-sufficiency, the prospect of leaving Rousseau and trying to survive independently was genuinely terrifying. So Sarah stayed, and the abuse continued, and in many ways intensified. Rousseau, perhaps feeling threatened by the new social order, perhaps angry about the loss of formal slavery, began treating Sarah with even greater cruelty than before. The beatings became more frequent and more severe. The sexual violence became more brutal, and Rousseau began implementing new forms of control that went beyond what he had done during the slavery period. In 1863, shortly after the supposed marriage, Rousseau began confining Sarah to her room when he left the plantation, locking the door to prevent her from leaving or having contact with anyone else. Initially, these confinements lasted hours, but they gradually extended to days as Rousseau found that he preferred having Sarah locked up and available only when he wanted her rather than having her moving freely through the house. Sarah testified that she would be locked in her room for 3 or 4 days at a time, let out only when Rousseau needed her to cook or clean, then locked up again as soon as those tasks were completed. By 1865, Sarah was spending more time locked in her room than free in the house. Rousseau would unlock her door in the morning, require her to prepare breakfast and complete household chores, then lock her back in her room for the remainder of the day. She was allowed out at night only when Rousseau wanted to use her sexually, after which she would be locked in again. She was fed irregularly and inadequately, given just enough food to keep her alive and functional, but kept in a state of chronic malnutrition that weakened her and made resistance even more impossible than it had been before. In 1867, Rousseau decided that Sarah's room was too large, that she didn't need the space, and that he wanted to use part of the room for storage. He had a wall built that divided the room, leaving Sarah with a space approximately 6 feet by 8 feet that contained a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and nothing else. This would be Sarah's primary living space for the next 4 years. A cell where she was confined for most of every day, allowed out only when Rousseau needed her labor or wanted to abuse her, then locked back in as if she were a possession to be stored when not in use. The psychological effects of this prolonged isolation and confinement were severe. Sarah later described feeling as if she was disappearing, as if the person she had been was being gradually erased by the unchanging routine of confinement, brief periods of forced labor and sexual abuse, then confinement again. She lost track of time, couldn't remember what year it was, couldn't distinguish one day from another. She began having difficulty speaking during the rare moments when Rousseau allowed her to talk, finding that words wouldn't come easily, that her voice sounded strange after so many hours of enforced silence. By 1870, Sarah's physical condition had deteriorated to the point where neighbors began to notice and to comment among themselves that something seemed wrong at the Rousseau plantation. They observed that Sarah was never seen outside the house, that smoke from the kitchen chimney appeared only at irregular times, suggesting meals were not being prepared on a normal schedule, that sometimes what sounded like screams or cries could be heard coming from the house late at night. Some neighbors considered reporting their concerns to authorities, but many were reluctant to interfere in what they assumed was a domestic situation between a man and his wife, particularly in a society where violence against women was considered a private family matter in which outsiders should not intervene. It was in 1871 that Rousseau's treatment of Sarah reached its final and most horrific phase. Sarah had become so weak from malnutrition and so damaged from years of abuse that she was no longer able to perform household tasks to Rousseau's satisfaction. Rather than recognize that her condition was the result of his abuse and inadequate feeding, Rousseau interpreted her weakness as defiance, as deliberate refusal to serve him properly. He decided that she needed to be punished and controlled more severely, that mere confinement to a small room was insufficient, that more extreme measures were required. Rousseau moved Sarah from the divided room off the kitchen to the basement of his house, a damp, dark space that had previously been used only for storage. He chained her to a support beam, using iron shackles on her wrists and ankles, connected by chains short enough that she could sit or lie down, but could not stand upright or move more than a few feet in any direction. He left her there, confined in darkness, bringing food and water irregularly, coming to use her sexually when he pleased, leaving her alone in the dark for hours or days at a time. Sarah later testified that the basement confinement was when she finally lost hope of survival, when she accepted that Rousseau was going to kill her eventually, and that death would be a relief from the suffering she endured. She stopped eating even the minimal food Rousseau provided, stopped trying to maintain any cleanliness or dignity, stopped responding when Rousseau came to abuse her. She was waiting to die, hoping it would come quickly, unable to imagine any other end to her suffering. But death didn't come quickly. Sarah's body, despite the abuse and starvation, proved resilient enough to cling to life even under conditions that should have been fatal. She remained chained in the basement for 8 months, from October 1870 until June 1871, existing in conditions that several physicians who later examined her compared to medieval torture chambers, to experiments in human suffering, to circumstances they had difficulty believing any human being could survive. During these 8 months, neighbors' concerns about the Rousseau plantation intensified. The sounds that could be heard from the house grew more disturbing. Not just occasional screams, but what sounded like prolonged suffering. Sounds of pain that suggested something far worse than ordinary domestic violence was occurring. Several neighbors separately wrote letters to federal authorities in New Orleans, describing their concerns and asking for investigation. These letters accumulated over months, and finally, in June 1871, a federal marshal named Thomas Whitfield was assigned to investigate the complaints about the Rousseau plantation. Marshal Whitfield arrived at the plantation on June 17, 1871, accompanied by two other federal officers and a local physician named Dr. Samuel Mitchell. Rousseau initially refused them entry, insisting that his home was his private property and that federal authorities had no right to enter without a warrant. But Whitfield had obtained a warrant based on the accumulated complaints from neighbors. And when Rousseau continued to obstruct entry, Whitfield informed him that the door would be broken down if he didn't unlock it voluntarily. Once inside, Whitfield and his colleagues conducted a thorough search of the house. They found the ground floor relatively normal, though poorly maintained and showing signs that regular housekeeping had not been done in months. The divided room off the kitchen showed evidence of long-term occupancy. A soiled mattress, accumulated waste in a chamber pot that hadn't been emptied in weeks, scratch marks on the walls suggesting someone had been confined there and had tried to mark the passage of time, or had simply acted out their distress on any surface they could reach. But it was in the basement that they found Sarah. Dr. Mitchell, who was the first to descend the stairs and who carried a lamp to illuminate the dark space, later testified that he initially thought he was looking at a corpse, that the figure chained to the support beam appeared to be a body that had been dead for some time. It was only when he approached closer and saw Sarah's chest moving with shallow breaths that he realized she was alive. Sarah was conscious but unresponsive to questions, or to Dr. Mitchell's presence. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Her body was skeletal, her bones visible through skin that was covered with sores and lesions from lying in her own waste. Her hair, which had once been long, had been cut short, or had fallen out in patches, leaving her scalp partially bald. The chains on her wrists and ankles had worn deep grooves into her skin. An infection was visible around these wounds. She smelled of decay and filth, and the area around where she was chained was covered in excrement and vomit. Dr. Mitchell immediately called for Marshal Whitfield, who came down to the basement and observed the scene with horror and outrage. Rousseau, who had followed the officers into his house, was confronted with what they had found. His explanation was that Sarah suffered from mental illness, that she was dangerous to herself and others, that the confinement and chains were necessary for her own protection and for his safety. He claimed that her physical condition was the result of her refusing to eat, of her self-destructive behaviors, of illnesses that he had tried to treat but that she had resisted. These explanations were immediately rejected by everyone present. Dr. Mitchell's medical training made it clear that Sarah's condition was the result of prolonged abuse and neglect, not of self-inflicted harm or mental illness. The evidence throughout the house suggested systematic confinement and control, not care for a disturbed person, and the testimony that would later be obtained from neighbors, from the few people who had seen Sarah before she was confined to the basement, would confirm that she had been a victim of continuous abuse for years, that Rousseau's claims of mental illness were fabrications designed to justify his treatment of her. Marshal Whitfield placed Jacob Rousseau under arrest on charges including assault, false imprisonment, and violations of federal laws protecting the rights of formerly enslaved people. Sarah was carefully removed from the chains that had held her, wrapped in blankets, and transported to a hospital in New Orleans where she could receive medical care. The initial prognosis was poor. Dr. Mitchell believed she might not survive more than a few days given the extent of her physical deterioration and the infections that had taken hold in her body, but Sarah survived. Her body, which had endured so much abuse for so long, proved resilient enough to respond to basic medical care and adequate nutrition. Within weeks, her weight began to increase, her infections responded to treatment, and her physical condition improved dramatically. The psychological recovery was slower and more complicated, as Sarah struggled with trauma that had accumulated over 23 years of captivity and abuse. Sarah's testimony, given gradually over several months as she regained strength and as physicians determined she was well enough to describe her experiences, provided the prosecution with detailed evidence of what Rousseau had done to her. She described the purchase at the slave auction in 1848, the immediate sexual abuse when she arrived at the plantation, the years of regular beatings and rape, the marriage that changed nothing about her condition, the progressive confinement that eventually led to being chained in the basement. Her testimony was consistent, detailed and devastating in its documentation of systematic abuse that had lasted for more than 2 decades. Medical evidence corroborated Sarah's testimony. Dr. Mitchell and other physicians who examined her documented scars covering most of her body, old fractures that had healed improperly, evidence of chronic malnutrition spanning years, damage to reproductive organs consistent with prolonged sexual violence, and psychological trauma manifesting in various symptoms, including difficulty speaking, nightmares, and episodes of dissociation where Sarah would become unresponsive and had to be gradually brought back to awareness of her surroundings. The trial of Jacob Rousseau began in November 1871 and attracted significant attention throughout Louisiana and beyond. The case was seen as a test of whether formerly enslaved people would receive justice under federal law, whether white men who had been slaveholders would be held accountable for continuing to abuse black people after emancipation, and whether the legal fiction of marriage could be used to shield ongoing enslavement and violence from legal consequences. Rousseau's defense attorneys argued that the prosecution was motivated by Northern hostility toward Southern customs, that Rousseau's relationship with Sarah should be understood in the context of Southern society, where relationships between white men and black women had long existed in complex forms that outsiders didn't understand. They presented Rousseau as a man who had actually helped Sarah by marrying her after emancipation, giving her protection and status as his wife, rather than leaving her to face the uncertain world as a freed slave with no resources. They also argued that Sarah's testimony was unreliable, that she was mentally unstable, as evidenced by her bizarre behaviors, including refusing to eat, that her physical condition was largely self-inflicted through her mental illness, and that Rousseau had been trying to care for her despite her condition. They produced the marriage certificate from 1863 and argued that this proved Rousseau had not been keeping Sarah as a slave, but as his legitimate wife, that what had occurred between them was the private business of a married couple, and that husbands had legal authority to control their wives' behavior, including through physical discipline when necessary. The prosecution, led by federal attorney Marcus Henderson, systematically dismantled these arguments. He presented testimony from neighbors describing the sounds they had heard coming from the Rousseau house, sounds that suggested torture rather than domestic discipline or care for a mentally ill person. He presented medical testimony documenting that Sarah's injuries were consistent with abuse rather than self-harm, that her malnutrition had been caused by inadequate feeding rather than by refusing to eat, and that her condition when found in the basement represented what happened to a human body subjected to prolonged confinement and neglect. Most importantly, Henderson addressed the question of the supposed marriage. He presented evidence that the marriage had never been legal under Louisiana law, that it had been a fiction created to allow Rousseau to continue enslaving Sarah under a different name. He argued that consent was required for a valid marriage, that Sarah had not consented but had been informed that she was now Rousseau's wife without any choice in the matter, and that calling enslavement marriage did not transform abuse into legitimate spousal authority. Henderson also placed Sarah's case in the broader context of Reconstruction and the struggle to end not just formal slavery, but the various ways that former slaveholders were attempting to maintain control over formerly enslaved people. He argued that if Rousseau was not held accountable, it would send a message that white men could continue to abuse black women as long as they called them wives instead of slaves, that emancipation would be meaningless if former masters could simply redefine their relationships and continue the same practices of ownership and violence. The jury, composed of both black and white men under federal Reconstruction policies, deliberated for 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Rousseau was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a harsh sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the federal government's determination to make an example of cases where former slaveholders had continued enslaving people after emancipation. The sentence was controversial in white Southern society, with many viewing it as excessive federal interference and as persecution of a man for exercising what they saw as his legitimate authority over his wife and household. But for formerly enslaved people, and for advocates of racial justice, the verdict represented a rare instance of accountability, a case where a white man who had abused a black woman faced serious consequences rather than being protected by white supremacist social and legal structures. Sarah's testimony had been believed, her suffering had been validated, and the man who had tormented her for 23 years would spend decades in prison as punishment for what he had done. Rousseau served 14 years of his sentence before dying in prison in 1885 at age 69. He never expressed remorse for his treatment of Sarah, maintaining until his death that he had been unjustly convicted for doing nothing more than what husbands throughout history had done in managing their households and their wives. His lack of remorse, his continued insistence that his behavior had been normal and appropriate, reflected how deeply the attitudes of slavery had shaped his worldview and how little the formal abolition of slavery had changed his belief that he had the right to own and control Sarah. Sarah's recovery from her ordeal was long and incomplete. She remained in medical care in New Orleans for over a year, gradually regaining physical strength and some measure of psychological stability. But the trauma of 23 years of enslavement, abuse, isolation, and torture had left deep psychological scars that would never fully heal. She experienced nightmares and flashbacks, had difficulty trusting people, struggled with periods of depression where she questioned whether survival had been worth the suffering she had endured. In 1873, with assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau and from charitable organizations supporting formerly enslaved people, Sarah moved to a small house in New Orleans, where she attempted to build an independent life. She took in sewing work, did laundry for paying customers, managed to earn enough to support herself modestly. She connected with a community of other formerly enslaved people, finding some comfort in sharing her experiences with others who understood what life under slavery had been like and what the struggle for real freedom involved. Sarah never married, never formed romantic relationships, never trusted another person enough to allow them close to her in ways that might have led to intimacy. The abuse she had suffered at Rousseau's hands had destroyed her ability to view relationships as potentially safe or fulfilling, had taught her that allowing someone power over her life meant inevitable suffering. She lived alone, kept to herself, maintained careful control over every aspect of her environment in ways that reflected her desperate need for autonomy after so many years of having no control over anything. In 1890, nearly 20 years after her rescue from Rousseau's basement, Sarah agreed to be interviewed by a journalist named Anna Roberts, who was documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people as part of an effort to create a historical record before the generation who had experienced slavery directly passed away. Sarah's testimony, published in a small abolitionist newspaper and later preserved in archives, provided one of the most detailed first-person accounts of slavery's continuation after emancipation, of how former slaveholders had used marriage as a cover for ongoing enslavement, and of the psychological and physical damage that prolonged abuse caused. In the interview, Sarah described not just the facts of what had happened to her, but the internal experience of being owned, of having her humanity systematically denied, of living in a state where she had no rights and no protection. She described learning to dissociate during abuse, to separate her consciousness from what was being done to her body, finding mental spaces where some fragment of self could persist despite the ongoing destruction of her personhood. She described the gradual erosion of hope, the way that year after year of unchanging abuse had convinced her that there would never be escape, that this was simply what her life was and would always be. She also described the strange experience of formal freedom making no difference in her actual life, of the Emancipation Proclamation being proclaimed while she remained enslaved in everything but legal terminology, of Reconstruction supposedly transforming Southern society while she remained chained in Rousseau's house, enduring the same abuse she had suffered when slavery was legal. She noted the bitter irony that it was only when neighbors finally reported the sounds of her suffering that authorities had intervened, that for years people had known or suspected something was wrong, but had not acted, that her suffering had been allowed to continue because people were reluctant to interfere in what appeared to be a domestic situation between a man and his wife. Sarah died in 1892 at age 59, her health broken by the years of abuse and malnutrition, her life shortened by trauma that had damaged her body and mind in ways that even 2 decades of freedom couldn't fully repair. She was buried in an unmarked grave in New Orleans, her death noted only in a brief mention in the same abolitionist newspaper that had published her interview. For many years she was forgotten, except by the few historians who had encountered her testimony and who recognized its importance as documentation of slavery's legacy. But Sarah's case had lasting impacts that extended far beyond her individual story. The trial of Jacob Rousseau had established important legal precedents about the rights of formerly enslaved people and about the illegitimacy of using marriage as cover for continued enslavement. Federal courts cited the Rousseau case in subsequent prosecutions of former slaveholders who had tried to maintain control over formerly enslaved people through various forms of debt peonage, labor contracts, or supposed marital relationships. The case helped establish that emancipation meant real freedom, not just a change in legal terminology, while substantive conditions of enslavement continued. The case also contributed to growing recognition of the particular vulnerabilities that Black women faced in the aftermath of slavery, the ways that sexual violence and abuse had been endemic to slavery and continued to threaten Black women even after formal emancipation. Reform organizations, women's rights advocates, and civil rights activists used Sarah's case as evidence of the need for stronger legal protections for Black women, for criminal prosecution of sexual violence, regardless of the racial identities of perpetrators and victims, and for social support systems that could help women escape abusive situations. Sarah's testimony during the trial had been particularly powerful because she had described not just physical abuse, but the psychological mechanisms of control that Rousseau had used to keep her enslaved even after she was legally free to leave. She explained how he had convinced her that she could not survive without him, that the outside world would be even more dangerous and hostile than what she experienced in his house, that attempting to escape would result in her recapture and even worse punishment. She described how isolation had been a key tool of control, how being kept separate from other people had prevented her from knowing what freedom looked like or from getting help that might have been available if she had been able to communicate her situation to others. These insights into the psychology of captivity and abuse influenced how activists and reformers thought about helping formerly enslaved people, particularly women who had been kept in conditions of sexual slavery by their former owners. It became clear that legal freedom was not sufficient if people remained psychologically trapped by the conditioning they had experienced during enslavement, if they lacked practical resources to support themselves, if they had no community connections to provide assistance and validation, and if they had not developed the sense of self-worth and autonomy necessary to recognize and assert their rights. The Freedmen's Bureau and various charitable organizations began developing programs specifically designed to help formerly enslaved women who had been subjected to sexual violence and ongoing exploitation by their former owners. These programs provided safe housing, job training, literacy education, and psychological support, recognizing that recovery from slavery required addressing not just immediate physical needs, but the deeper psychological damage that years of abuse had caused. Sarah herself benefited from these programs and later participated in helping other women who were attempting to rebuild lives after similar experiences. The publicity around Sarah's case also sparked broader conversations about domestic violence and the legal doctrine of coverture, which gave husbands extensive legal authority over their wives and which made it difficult for women to seek legal protection from abusive spouses. Feminist activists pointed out that Rousseau had exploited this doctrine by claiming that his relationship with Sarah was a marriage and that his treatment of her fell within the legitimate authority that the law gave to husbands. They argued that coverture needed to be reformed or abolished, that women needed legal personhood and rights independent of their husbands, and that marriage should not provide legal cover for violence and abuse. These arguments faced substantial resistance from those who believed that traditional family structures and male authority within marriage were essential to social order. But cases like Sarah's, where the doctrine of marital authority had been used to shield what was clearly systematic torture and imprisonment, provided powerful evidence for the need for legal reform. Over the following decades, state legislatures gradually revised laws governing marriage and divorce, expanding women's rights within marriage and creating legal mechanisms for women to escape abusive relationships without being legally penalized for abandoning their marital duties. By the mid-1870s, as Reconstruction began to collapse, and as federal troops withdrew from southern states, the progress that had been made in protecting formerly enslaved people began to erode. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to reassert white control over Black populations, targeting Black people who had achieved economic success or political power and creating an atmosphere of terror designed to force Black people back into subordinate positions. The legal and political gains of Reconstruction were systematically dismantled through violence, discriminatory laws, and the withdrawal of federal protection. In this deteriorating environment, cases like Sarah's became increasingly rare. The federal courts and military authorities that had prosecuted Jacob Rousseau lost their power and jurisdiction as Reconstruction ended. State and local authorities in Louisiana and throughout the South showed little interest in prosecuting white men for crimes against Black women, and the social attitudes that had enabled slavery reemerged in only slightly modified forms. Black women who were subjected to violence and exploitation had few avenues for seeking justice or protection, and many found themselves in situations that resembled Sarah's enslavement even though formal slavery no longer existed. Sarah herself remained aware of these broader social and political changes and recognized how fortunate she had been to have been rescued and to have seen her abuser prosecuted during the brief window when federal authorities had the power and will to intervene. She knew that women in similar situations after the end of Reconstruction would likely receive no help, that their suffering would go unnoticed or would be ignored by authorities who were unwilling or unable to challenge white male power over black women. This knowledge fueled Sarah's decision to participate in efforts to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people and to advocate for continued federal protection of black civil rights. She worked with various reform organizations, sharing her story when she felt strong enough to do so, providing testimony that was used in advocacy efforts aimed at maintaining or strengthening legal protections against racial violence and exploitation. Her willingness to repeatedly describe traumatic experiences, despite the psychological toll it took on her, reflected her understanding that her story had power to influence people and policy, that making her suffering visible could potentially prevent others from experiencing similar abuse. In 1873, with assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau and from charitable organizations supporting formerly enslaved people, Sarah moved to a small house in New Orleans where she attempted to build an independent life. The house was modest, just 2 small rooms, but it was hers, the first space she had ever occupied that belonged to her, rather than to someone who owned or controlled her. She furnished it simply with items donated by charitable organizations, and with a few pieces she purchased with money she had saved from the small stipend the Freedmen's Bureau provided to formerly enslaved people who were attempting to establish themselves independently. Sarah took in sewing work, doing alterations and repairs for paying customers. The work was familiar. She had been forced to do similar work for Rousseau, but doing it for wages, for customers who treated her with basic respect, made it feel entirely different. She could refuse work she didn't want to do, could negotiate her rates, could control her own time and schedule. These small freedoms, which most people took for granted, were revelatory to Sarah after 23 years of having no control over anything. She also did laundry for paying customers, work that was physically demanding but that allowed her to earn enough to support herself modestly. She was careful with money, having learned during her years of deprivation to value every resource and to plan carefully for future needs. She saved small amounts when she could, building a reserve that provided some sense of security against the unpredictability of life as a poor black woman in Reconstruction-era Louisiana. Living independently was psychologically challenging in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. She had to make constant decisions about how to organize her time, what work to accept, how to manage her household, how to interact with neighbors and customers. After years of having every decision made for her, often violently enforced, the responsibility of making choices paralyzed her at times. She would stand in her small house, unsure whether she should eat or work or rest, unable to decide because no one was telling her what to do and because her own preferences and needs felt unfamiliar and untrustworthy. Sarah connected with a community of other formerly enslaved people in her New Orleans neighborhood, finding some comfort in sharing her experiences with others who understood what life under slavery had been like and what the struggle for real freedom involved. Many of her neighbors had their own stories of abuse and exploitation, and while few had experienced anything as extreme as Sarah's 23 years of captivity and torture, all understood the psychological burden of having been treated as property, of having survived by suppressing their own humanity, and of now trying to rebuild identities and lives as free people. The community provided practical support as well as emotional connection. Neighbors shared resources, helped each other with work, looked after each other during illnesses or difficult times. For Sarah, this community became crucial to her survival, providing the social connection and mutual aid that she had been denied during her years of isolation with Rousseau. She gradually developed trust in certain neighbors, allowing relationships to form that helped counter the lesson Rousseau had taught her through violence, that other people were dangerous, and that connection meant vulnerability to harm. But Sarah never fully overcame her trauma. She never married, never formed romantic relationships, never trusted another person enough to allow them close to her in ways that might have led to intimacy. The sexual violence she had suffered at Rousseau's hands for more than 2 decades had destroyed her ability to view physical or emotional intimacy as potentially safe or desirable. The thought of allowing someone that kind of access to her body or her emotional life triggered panic and flashbacks to her years of abuse. She lived alone, kept careful control over her environment, maintained routines that gave structure to her days and that helped her feel safe. She locked her doors obsessively, checking multiple times before bed to ensure she was secure. She slept poorly, waking frequently from nightmares in which she was back in Rousseau's house, back in the basement, back in chains. She learned to manage these symptoms, to calm herself when panic struck, to distinguish between memories and present reality, but the symptoms never fully disappeared. Sarah also struggled with what would later be recognized as survivor's guilt, questioning why she had survived when so many other enslaved people had died from abuse, disease, or violence. She had learned during her testimony at Rousseau's trial that other enslaved people who had worked on his plantation had died or disappeared over the years, that she was not the only victim of his violence, that her survival had been partly luck and partly Rousseau's decision that keeping her alive suited his purposes. The knowledge that others had suffered and died while she survived created psychological burden that added to her trauma. In 1876, Sarah experienced a severe depression that lasted several months and that nearly resulted in her death from self-neglect. She stopped working, stopped eating adequately, stopped maintaining her house or herself. Neighbors who checked on her found her unresponsive and withdrew. Lying in bed, staring at nothing, barely alive, they brought her to the Freedmen's Bureau Hospital, where she had recovered after being rescued from Rousseau, and physicians there recognized that she was experiencing what they called melancholia, a severe depression that was common among people who had experienced extreme trauma. Treatment for mental illness in the 1870s was limited and often ineffective, but the physicians caring for Sarah had learned from their experiences treating other formerly enslaved people that social connection, meaningful work, and gradual rebuilding of routine could help people recover from depressive episodes. They kept Sarah in the hospital for several weeks, ensuring she received adequate nutrition and rest, and gradually reintroduced her to activities and social interaction. Slowly, over months, Sarah recovered enough to return to her house and resume her independent life, though the depression would recur periodically throughout her remaining years. In 1890, nearly 20 years after her rescue from Rousseau's basement, Sarah agreed to be interviewed by a journalist named Anna Roberts, who was documenting the experiences of formerly enslaved people as part of an effort to create a historical record before the generation who had experienced slavery directly passed away. The interview took place over several sessions, as Sarah found it emotionally exhausting to describe her experiences in detail and needed breaks to manage the psychological impact of revisiting traumatic memories. Sarah's testimony to Anna Roberts, published in a small abolitionist newspaper called the Freedmen's Advocate, and later preserved in archives, provided one of the most detailed first-person accounts of slavery's continuation after emancipation, of how former slaveholders had used marriage as a cover for ongoing enslavement, and of the psychological and physical damage that prolonged abuse caused. The published interview was several thousand words long, and was notable for Sarah's willingness to describe not just the facts of what had happened to her, but the internal experience of being owned, of having her humanity systematically denied, of living in a state where she had no rights and no protection. In the interview, Sarah described learning to dissociate during abuse, to separate her consciousness from what was being done to her body, finding mental spaces where some fragment of self could persist despite the ongoing destruction of her personhood. She explained that during the worst abuse, particularly during sexual violence, she would imagine herself floating above her body, watching from a distance what was happening to the physical form below while keeping her essential self separate and protected. This dissociation had been necessary for psychological survival, but it had also created a sense of disconnection from her own body and identity that persisted even years after the abuse ended. She described the gradual erosion of hope, the way that year after year of unchanging abuse had convinced her that there would never be escape, that this was simply what her life was and would always be. She explained that by the time federal authorities found her in Rousseau's basement, she had completely abandoned hope of survival or rescue, that she had been waiting to die and had viewed death as the only escape from suffering that would never end. The fact that rescue came felt unreal to her even years later, as if it had happened to someone else rather than to her. Sarah also described the strange experience of formal freedom making no difference in her actual life, of the Emancipation Proclamation being proclaimed while she remained enslaved in everything but legal terminology, of Reconstruction supposedly transforming Southern society while she remained chained in Rousseau's house, enduring the same abuse she had suffered when slavery was legal. She noted the bitter irony that it was only when neighbors finally reported the sounds of her suffering that authorities had intervened, that for years people had known or suspected something was wrong but had not acted, that her suffering had been allowed to continue because people were reluctant to interfere in what appeared to be a domestic situation between a man and his wife. This last point particularly struck Anna Roberts, who was herself an advocate for women's rights and who recognized the broader implications of Sarah's observation. Roberts wrote in her introduction to the published interview that Sarah's case demonstrated how legal and social doctrines about marital privacy and male authority within families created cover for abuse, that women throughout society, not just formerly enslaved black women, suffered violence that went unpunished because it occurred within domestic spaces that the law treated as private and beyond the reach of public intervention. Roberts used Sarah's story as part of broader arguments for legal reforms that would protect women from domestic violence, that would recognize that violence within families was not private but was a matter of public concern and criminal justice. She pointed out that if Rousseau had committed the same acts against Sarah in a public space, he would have been arrested immediately and prosecuted without controversy, but because he committed them within his home and claimed the authority of a husband, he was able to continue for years before anyone intervened. This double standard, Roberts argued, needed to be eliminated through legal reforms that gave women rights and protections within marriage, and that made domestic violence prosecutable as criminal assault, regardless of the relationship between perpetrator and victim. Sarah's willingness to participate in Roberts' interview project, despite the personal cost of revisiting traumatic experiences, reflected her commitment to using her story to create change that might protect others. She told Roberts that if describing what had happened to her could prevent even one woman from experiencing similar abuse, or could help even one person escape from an abusive situation, then the pain of telling the story would be worthwhile. This sense of purpose, of her suffering having meaning beyond itself, seemed to provide Sarah with some measure of comfort and helped her manage the ongoing psychological burden of trauma. The published interview attracted significant attention when it appeared in the Freedmen's Advocate in 1890. Abolitionists and civil rights advocates used it as evidence of the ongoing need for federal protection of black civil rights in the South, pointing out that Sarah's case demonstrated how quickly formal freedom could become meaningless without robust legal enforcement and without social and economic resources to make freedom real. Women's rights advocates used the interview to argue for legal reforms regarding domestic violence and women's rights within marriage. Social reformers used it to call for better mental health care and social support systems for people who had experienced severe trauma. But the interview also attracted negative attention from those who viewed it as exaggerating or misrepresenting Southern society. Some critics accused Sarah of fabricating or embellishing her story to gain sympathy or financial support. Others acknowledged that abuse might have occurred, but argued that it was an isolated case rather than representative of broader social patterns, that it was unfair to use one extreme example to make arguments about systemic problems. Still others argued that whatever had happened to Sarah was ancient history by 1890, that bringing up events from decades earlier served no purpose except to inflame racial tensions, and to prevent the reconciliation between North and South that many believed was necessary for national unity. These criticisms distressed Sarah, who had not anticipated that sharing her story would result in her being attacked or having her truthfulness questioned. She gave no further interviews after the Roberts piece was published, declining requests from other journalists and researchers who wanted to document her experiences. She retreated back into her private life, focusing on the daily work of survival and on maintaining the small measure of stability and safety she had achieved in her independent life. Sarah continued to live in her small house in New Orleans, continuing to support herself through sewing and laundry work, continuing to struggle with trauma symptoms that never fully resolved. She remained connected to her community of neighbors and fellow formerly enslaved people, participating in churches and mutual aid societies that provided social connection and support. She never spoke publicly about her experiences again after the 1890 interview, though she occasionally shared her story in private conversations with other women who had experienced abuse and who found in Sarah's survival some evidence that recovery from severe trauma was possible. By the early 1890s, Sarah's health was declining. The years of abuse and malnutrition during her enslavement had damaged her body in ways that even decades of freedom couldn't fully repair. She developed chronic respiratory problems, likely the result of years spent in the damp, unventilated basement where Rousseau had kept her chained. She also experienced chronic pain from old injuries that had healed improperly, particularly in her wrists and ankles where the chains had worn grooves into bone. These physical problems, combined with the ongoing psychological burden of trauma, made her final years difficult despite her freedom. Sarah died on February 18, 1892, at age 59, in the same small house where she had lived independently for nearly 20 years. She died from pneumonia, a respiratory infection that her weakened lungs couldn't fight off. A neighbor found her several days after her death, having noticed that Sarah's door hadn't opened for several days and that no smoke came from her chimney. Sarah was buried in an unmarked grave in New Orleans, her death noted only in a brief mention in the Freedman's Advocate, the newspaper that had published her interview 2 years earlier. For many decades after Sarah's death, her story was largely forgotten, except by the few historians who had encountered her testimony in the Freedman's Advocate, and who recognized its importance as documentation of slavery's legacy and the particular vulnerabilities that Black women faced during and after slavery. Her grave remained unmarked, and her name was absent from most historical accounts of Reconstruction Louisiana, despite the significance of her case for understanding how emancipation was experienced by those who had been enslaved. It was not until the late 20th century, as historians began to focus more attention on the experiences of enslaved women and on the continuation of slavery-like conditions after formal emancipation, that Sarah's case received renewed attention. Scholars studying gender, race, and violence recognize Sarah's testimony as an invaluable primary source documenting the intersection of these issues. Her case was analyzed in academic studies of domestic violence, sexual slavery, trauma, and the legal and social mechanisms that enabled abuse to continue even after slavery was abolished. Sarah's case also became important for understanding the psychology of trauma and the long-term effects of severe abuse. Mental health professionals studying post-traumatic stress disorder recognized in Sarah's experiences and symptoms many of the core features of PTSD that are now well documented: intrusive memories and flashbacks, hypervigilance and extreme startle responses, difficulty trusting others, dissociation as a coping mechanism, survivor's guilt, and chronic depression. Sarah's testimony from the 1890s provided historical evidence that these trauma symptoms were not modern phenomena, but were recognized patterns of response to extreme stress even in earlier eras, though the medical understanding and terminology were different. The legal precedent established by Jacob Rousseau's prosecution and conviction also gained renewed appreciation from scholars studying the history of civil rights and domestic violence law. The Rousseau case was recognized as one of the first federal prosecutions to establish that marriage did not provide legal immunity for abuse, that husbands could not use the doctrine of coverture to shield systematic torture and imprisonment from legal consequences. While this precedent was not consistently enforced in the decades immediately following the case, and while many women continued to experience domestic violence without legal protection, the principle established in the Rousseau case became part of the legal foundation for later reforms that expanded women's rights and created legal mechanisms for prosecuting domestic violence. Today, Sarah's story is taught in some university courses on African American history, women's history, and the history of slavery and its aftermath. Her testimony is included in documentary collections about formerly enslaved people's experiences. Her case is cited in academic literature about trauma, about sexual violence, and about the complex relationship between legal freedom and actual lived experience of autonomy and safety. Though she died in obscurity and her grave remains unmarked, Sarah's willingness to testify about what had happened to her ensured that her story was preserved and that it continues to educate and influence understanding more than a century after her death. The Rousseau plantation where Sarah was enslaved and tortured no longer exists. The house burned down in the early 20th century, and the land was eventually subdivided and developed for other uses. There is no historical marker noting what occurred there, no public acknowledgement of the suffering that took place in that house over 23 years. The physical location where Sarah endured abuse that should have been unimaginable has been erased from the landscape, leaving only documentary records to testify to what happened there. But the questions Sarah's case raises remain relevant and unresolved. How many other women experienced similar abuse during and after slavery, but never had the opportunity to testify about it, never had their abusers prosecuted, never received justice or acknowledgement of their suffering? How many people remain trapped in situations that resemble Sarah's enslavement even in the present day, held by violence, by psychological manipulation, by social and economic circumstances that make escape impossible even when legal freedom exists? What does it mean to be free in legal terms while remaining practically enslaved by abuse, by poverty, by lack of resources and support? Sarah's 23 years under Jacob Rousseau's control, and particularly the 8 years after emancipation when she remained enslaved in everything but name, demonstrate that freedom requires more than just formal legal status. It requires economic resources, social support, psychological capacity to imagine and pursue autonomous life, and legal systems that actually protect people from violence and exploitation rather than providing cover for abuse through doctrines about privacy and family authority. Sarah's survival, her eventual escape, her prosecution of her abuser, and her attempts to build an independent life all represent victories against overwhelming odds. But they also represent incompleteness, freedom that came too late, justice that was partial at best, recovery that remained limited by trauma that could never be fully healed. Her story is both inspiring in its demonstration of human resilience and devastating in its documentation of what one person endured and what countless others endured without ever receiving the intervention, justice, or acknowledgement that Sarah received. What do you think about Sarah's case? Should Jacob Rousseau's sentence have been longer? What does it mean that Sarah remained enslaved for 8 years after the Emancipation Proclamation supposedly freed her? How do we understand the relationship between legal freedom and actual lived experience of autonomy? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.